Thank you very much. Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation to speak. This is my very first EuroMeSCo meeting. I actually want to slightly complicate what Hugh was talking about, which is, although I agree with him that the cases or the challenges that we're witnessing in different countries in the region have their own dynamics and cannot be addressed through one formula. What I want to do is link the domestic context with the regional and international context, in a way building on what Salam has beautifully presented in his talk about Syria. What I'm saying is the title of this panel is Democratic Transition and National Conflict. Unfortunately, today, democratic transition has been overshadowed by conflict and by discourse about ISIS. And ISIS is actually both a problem and a symptom. And if there is one link that I would make between the cases of practically all the countries of the Arab world, it's inequality. And inequality is a key factor that has led to extremism in many conflicts. So although the cases are distinct, there is a thread that links what is happening in different places. And actually the dynamics derailing democratic transition in Syria, in Libya, in other places in the region are also the same dynamics that have contributed to the rise of violence, and ISIS is an illustration of that. So for example, in Yemen, we have seen tensions within Yemen as a result of the Saudi-led exclusion of the Houthi community, which was seen as pro-Iranian and became pro-Iranian. In the beginning, the label wasn't quite accurate, but it became accurate. In a way, it became a self-fulfilling prophecy. This policy of exclusion led one particular community towards, trying now to take over the country at the expense of pluralism and inclusiveness. So what I want to talk about today is these kinds of dynamics in countries in transition in the region and linking them to the role of the European Union and EU countries and the West more generally. So if we start with Iraq, there were existing sectarian problems in Iraq that were actually exacerbated by American and European foreign policies. Salam just talked about how the Iraqi army equipment was seized by ISIS. This happened because the West was giving funding to the Iraqi army without accountability. So we had support for the army without good governance measures for the Iraqi government. And this has led to marginalization of the Sunni community in Iraq and the government seen by the Sunni community as personalized. So the rise of ISIS came because it represented an opportunity for revenge for a number of Sunnis in the country. So this is how foreign support actually backfired because it did not pay attention to the very important dimension, which is good governance. In Syria, we had a peaceful protest turned into violence because of regime brutality. But the West offered inadequate support for the opposition while largely turning a blind eye to transgressions by the regime. For the last few years, since the beginning of the uprising, most of what we've seen regarding Western support for the Syrian opposition has been in the form of humanitarian aid that has basically been no more than a band-aid, while turning a blind eye to the Assad regime. And today there is this kind of paradox in that the West is going after ISIS while, turning a blind eye again to the Assad regime. So in a way, the formula that is being communicated here is that stability is more important than democracy. And I would say a similar scenario even applies in Egypt, whereby US and foreign aid in general was being sent to Egypt without being tied to measures of good governance. And this happened under the previous rule of President Morsi, and it's happening again with the rule of Sisi, despite transgressions on freedom of expression and human rights happening both under the previous regime and the current one, with continued crackdowns on not just the Muslim Brotherhood but even secular activists. So again, the message that's being communicated indirectly by the West is that stability is more important than democracy. So here we see that national conflicts are no longer purely national. Everything that is happening within each country is linked to dynamics that go beyond, the domestic context. And this applies to trajectories of violence as well. In Egypt, for example, there is a two-step radicalization process in place. The crackdown that the government is engaging in against the Muslim Brotherhood is pushing quite a few youth, mainly, but not necessarily just youth, towards violence. These youth who turn to violence against the state as a means of revenge are becoming prey to jihadism. So they don't go directly to become global jihadists. No, they turn into violence, and this makes them attractive to jihadist recruitment. And this is what sending some of these Egyptian people to join groups like ISIS. So again, if we think about ISIS as now, this problem that the international community is regarding as a shared issue globally, think about how foreign policies and aid policies are indirectly contributing to sustaining this problem. In Syria, of course, we have a conflict with a spillover that's being felt in neighboring countries. So again, it's not just a domestic conflict, it is very much a regional and international concern. Jordan, for example, has southern areas populated mainly by Sunni tribes that happen to be very poor, living on the margins. Among Lebanese factions, simply because of the fact of, this race to self-arming and the lack of a government in place, coupled with tensions regarding the presence of the Syrians in the country. And here, all we have to think about is the scenario of the Palestinian refugees and the Palestinian refugee camps that Lebanon, is still experiencing until today, and how that played a role in instability in the country. Iraq, of course, now we have a new government in place, but it will not be easy to reverse years of discrimination among or against Sunnis in the country. And the new Iraqi government will actually find it difficult to claim credibility. Add to this rising sectarian tensions between Shia and Sunnis as a result of the rise of ISIS. That is, again, something that is spilling over in the region as a whole. So add to this domestic kind of dimension and how Western, inadequate policies have contributed to this. Add to this the regional rivalries between mainly Saudi Arabia and Iran and their clients in Syria, in Lebanon, in Iraq, in Yemen, and how this rivalry has also contributed to the fragmentation that we are witnessing in these countries, not just between regimes and oppositions, but also, for example, within the Syrian opposition itself. Add to this the domestic tensions that are the result of the coalition against ISIS that has been formed. What we're seeing here is countries in the region like Jordan, like Gulf countries, like Lebanon, but also Western countries that are members of the coalition, making themselves vulnerable to ISIS retaliation because the coalition's so-called strategy is not a comprehensive strategy at all. And it is mainly based on airstrikes, which, as we know from the cases of Somalia, from the cases of Yemen, from the cases of Pakistan and others, have never led to the eradication of any Islamist extremist group. And actually, I call it poking the hornet's nest. So the airstrikes are actually causing ISIS to become more popular, to attract more sympathizers, to become actually legitimate in the eyes of its supporters supporters, because it says it's fighting a war against crusades, and now the coalition has come to, in a way, validate that narrative. And because the countries of the coalition do not have a full comprehensive strategy in place for dealing with the consequences, I think we are all now more vulnerable than ever before. The problem here is that the coalition plan so far does not have a political plan for governing Syria once the dust settles. So assuming ISIS is eradicated, who will govern Syria? We're not seeing a political strategy that runs parallel to the already inadequate military strategy. And here Libya becomes a cautionary tale, with the West rushing to engage in military action without adequate understanding of local dynamics and without having a political plan in place to keep the country together and prevent it from descending into complete chaos. The other issue that is missing from the coalition plan is a strategy addressing the political, social and economic grievances that have made ISIS attractive in the first place. And here I talk about, inequality, exclusion. Why do the tribes in Iraq, the Sunni tribes, affiliate themselves with ISIS in the first place? Why are people in Syria, living under ISIS rule in Raqqa? There are economic and social and political reasons for this that need to be addressed if we're going to really talk about eradicating ISIS. Airstrikes or even any kind of military activity on its own is not going to be enough. So here, when we talk about a role for the EU, it becomes very clear that the EU can definitely be involved in addressing these economic, social and political grievances, in working towards establishing a transitional government in Syria, in doing a lot on the ground in Iraq, in helping Lebanon handle the refugee problem that is breaking the Lebanese economy and social fabric. There is a lot that European countries can do. And here, as a framework for engagement in the region, I just want to emphasize that, as you have seen, no national conflict can be addressed without also taking into consideration the regional dimension, and vice versa. No cross-border conflict like the ISIS problem can be dealt with adequately without taking into consideration the domestic dimension in each of the places we are talking about. And also, this is a moment for self-reflection to think about the international dimension when it comes to the role of foreign policy blunders over the years, whether deliberate, such as the invasion of Iraq, or, indirect, such as the turning a blind eye to the crucial issue of good governance in Iraq. And also when it comes to the Syrian conflict in particular, which is at the heart of further conflicts in the region and further tensions that we are witnessing today, for a very long time we have seen this conflict being in a way addressed as something that does not concern us. So over here in Europe, there is this dominant trend that national conflicts in the Middle East are not our problem. So we either ignore them or we mishandle them, but actually by doing so, they eventually do become our problem. And this is where we are today. And this is where I will end. Thank you.
Thank you, Lina.